Chapter 16, Dr. Frank. When it finally came time for Caroline's trial, I must have appeared as though it were me whose life was at the mercy of a panel of jurors and a crowd of onlookers peering through the squares of glass to catch the latest case to satisfy their itch. I hadn't slept a wink since I'd read my mother's letter and learned of the first victim lost at the hands of my creature. Perhaps I should have just come out with it and confessed it was my own hands that led to the loss of an innocent child. How was it that the hideous demon got to roam free while this young boy was now buried in the very ground this thing scours for food and targets? When I arrived in court that morning to see what fate awaited Ezra's wife and the mother of his dead child, I must have appeared to be the very look of a living nightmare. And yet, I imagined that my haggard exterior paled in the comparison to the torture I suffered inwardly. Even worse, I could see no recourse to rectify the hell where I now found myself. It was bizarre, to say the least, that the first time I should have the occasion to meet my sister-in-law, we would be sitting before a judge and jury that was deciding her destiny as the accused murderer of her vulnerable toddler, remarkably close to the same age Ezra was when I first gazed upon him so many years ago. The world where we met and traded affections and love for one another was absolutely unrecognizable in this new landscape of horror. I couldn't imagine a world in which joy and love were once bestowed upon me. It is quite something to reflect upon that life now, as I know that I, too, can blame no one but myself for choosing ambition over a union with others. But it is useless to mourn that now. That life is long gone. I could see that not so long ago. Caroline held the countenance of a lovely woman. Her hair was tangled in a matted lump and stuck out several inches past her face. Deep pools of a bluish tint hung underneath her eyes, revealing how poorly she had slept since her arrest. She hung her head ever so slightly. I could see that Ezra was quite affected by how quickly she had unraveled, but I was, as yet, unsure if he was aware of the creation he had helped bring to life, the root of ruin to his family, or if he believed her to be the sudden catalyst for all of this torment he now faced. For the most part, Caroline remained calm and silent during the trial's proceedings, until the moment the prosecution showed the courtroom the photograph of little Justin's body lying lifeless on the ground. At that point, Caroline began to rave and jerk wildly in her chair, taking on the appearance of a raging animal, until the judge wielded threats that succeeded in controlling her. Ezra couldn't take seeing what had happened to his wife, that much was clear, and as she thrashed against her chair, Ezra brusquely walked out of the courtroom. I sat at the edge of one of the rows. When he breezed past me, air from underneath his jacket washed over me, but he seemed to not even recognize me, even when we were inches apart. When he returned, he sat at the back of the room, speaking to no one, his eyes hollowed out and numb. His wife insisted upon her innocence throughout her testimony on the stand, claiming she had no idea how the boy's locket ended up with her possessions inside the house. I could tell by the expression on the faces of the jurors that they anticipated a more convincing justification from the defendant, some sort of plausible theory as to why the authorities had found the piece of jewelry with her possessions. Before she left the stand, her attorney gave her the opportunity to express anything that had been left unsaid. I know it is hard to believe I am innocent of these charges, given this one detail about the locket that my little darling boy has worn every day of his young life, she began, looking at the jury. Her focus was steadfast, but her trembling jaw gave her away. But all I can tell you is I have no reason to kill my own child, who is my whole life and reason for being. I wish I knew what it was the murderer wanted, or why they want to frame me for such a horrendous act against a creature that came from my own body, who captured my whole heart from the first minute his sweaty cheek rested against my breast. I can only assume the murderer was not of sound mind, but I have no earthly idea who this foul monster is. I can't imagine what it would want with me or my child. I only urge you to have sympathy for me and to consider in your hearts what possible motivation I could have for committing such an act. If you have no answer, then I plead you to find me not guilty. I found myself so moved by this plea I began to weep, even when I had so many reasons to wish only ill on Ezra. Ezra, who had not laid so much as one eye on me, flicked his gaze toward me only for a moment, and then went back to staring at his wife with the same blank expression. I did not only cry for Caroline, who was but a proxy for my own misdeeds, but also for the lost children Ezra and I once were. And I cried for Justin, the little innocent child I had never known, the sibling of that creature who ultimately brought him to his death. Caroline's testimony was not enough to sway the jury or judge. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. I hoped that there was some sort of appeals process Caroline could file to alter her sentence, but less than a week after her verdict, my mother, who I spoke to briefly at the trial, called me on the phone to tell me in an eerily numb effect that Caroline had hung herself in the early hours of the morning in her holding cell. Ezra was so distraught, my mother took him to the old country house to care for him in his time of grief. I don't know if he ever knew it was his own child that was the true criminal responsible for this act, his own sabotage behind the criminal's life and creation. It was still hard to believe that my creation, which I had once thought would fill the world with progress and future joys, could be the site of so much wreckage. Where I had yearned to create life, only death followed in its place. There was no one I could go to with this knowledge, for anyone I attempted to explain this to would simply call me a raving lunatic. Most everyone would see me as a hysteric woman gone mad. I also knew that Ezra, even if he did have some insight into who might have done this, would certainly take his secret to his grave, especially now that it had caused the losses of both his child and his spouse. This is how my tale of destruction, spun forward from my own bloody hands, began, with these two victims of my own creation, and thus my own victims as well.